If you map out where humans actually live in the United States, you hit a massive invisible wall right around the 98th meridian of longitude. It slices the country cleanly in half. Exactly 80% of all Americans live crammed into the eastern half of this divide. Cross that line to the west, and you enter a vast, echoing void holding just 1 in 5 citizens. Most of that tiny western population doesn't even live in the interior. They are clustered onto a narrow coastal strip along the Pacific in states like California and Washington. This population density map of the United States reveals a bizarre geographic reality. 80% of all Americans are tightly packed into the eastern half of the country, and that dense settlement abruptly stops at an invisible vertical line near the 100th meridian. The remaining 20% of the population occupies the entire western half of the continent. But even that number is deceiving, because the vast majority of those western residents are squeezed against the extreme edge of the Pacific coast in states like California. Take the coastal cities out of the equation, and you are left with a massive interior western landmass stretching across half the continent. This immense territory holds only about as many people as the New York City metro area alone. This extreme demographic split has nothing to do with early colonial politics or the timeline of westward migration. It is a strict physical boundary dictated entirely by the shape of the North American continent. The primary culprits for this division are the massive western mountain chains, specifically the Rocky Mountains. They form a towering barrier, thousands of miles long, with peaks soaring past 14,000 feet. This cross-section shows how mountains dictate weather. Pacific clouds hit western peaks, dropping rain on the western slopes. Descending the other side, the air is stripped of water. This rain shadow physically starves the interior plains. In the east, the geography operates completely differently. The Appalachian Mountains are roughly half the height of the Rockies. They act as minor speed bumps, allowing storm systems from the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico to easily carry their moisture deep into the interior. This uneven distribution of rain preordained the fate of the country before anyone ever drew a map. The East received the steady rainfall required for lush agriculture and dense human settlement, while the interior West was locked into remaining a dry, hostile frontier. In 1878, a geologist and explorer named John Wesley Powell ventured into this unmapped terrain and recognized the severe limits of its climate. Powell analyzed Smithsonian weather data and created this map. It clearly shows that past the 100th meridian, average annual rainfall consistently drops below 20 inches. That specific number is the absolute minimum required to grow traditional crops. At the time, the government was handing out 160-acre plots of land under the Homestead Act. That size worked perfectly for a family farm in the rain-soaked East. But Powell realized that applying those exact same plots to the dry dirt of the West guaranteed total agricultural failure without massive coordinated irrigation. Powell's data proved a harsh truth. Settlers could not simply copy Eastern habits into the West. Surviving there required a completely different society, engineered entirely around water scarcity. Powell took his findings to Congress with a radical scientific proposal. He argued that the government should abandon traditional grid-like state borders. Instead, he presented this map, dividing the West into organic, uneven shapes that perfectly outlined natural watersheds. Under this system, every drop of rain within a boundary would naturally funnel into a single central river. Every new state would have exclusive control over its own self-contained water supply, eliminating the risk of future states fighting over shared resources. Politicians flatly rejected his warnings. Congress was heavily influenced by the railroad lobby, which wanted rapid settlement at all costs. Politicians instead embraced an unscientific myth called rain follows the plow, a literal belief that simply digging the dirt would magically cause rain. Ignoring Powell's science, the government carved the desert into arbitrary, perfect squares. These straight lines permanently fractured critical river systems, splitting single sources of water across multiple competing political jurisdictions. By ignoring the physical reality of the rain shadow, lawmakers legally mandated a resource system that was mathematically destined to run out of water. Today, massive populations do exist in the arid West. Millions of people live inside sprawling metropolis grids like Phoenix and Las Vegas, built directly on top of bone-dry desert land. But these cities only survive through brute force 20th century engineering. It took colossal concrete dams, deep reservoirs, and hundreds of miles of aqueducts to artificially redirect the continent's limited, fractured rivers to these desert populations. That water infrastructure, combined with the widespread adoption of air conditioning, made the punishing heat tolerable. Technology masked the geography, triggering a massive population boom. Yet this explosive western expansion is entirely dependent on an engineering illusion. It is a temporary fix that delays but does not solve the consequences of building entire civilizations inside a rain shadow. Now, the continent's geography is overpowering that infrastructure. The American West is currently trapped in its most severe megadrought in over 1,000 years. The Colorado River, the heavily engineered lifeblood that supplies water to 40 million Westerners, is collapsing. It is now drawn down so heavily by competing states that the river no longer reaches the sea. Massive regional reservoirs have hit historic critical lows. This lack of supply has triggered emergency federal water cuts and bitter legal battles between states over who gets the last remaining drops. And driven by climate change, the geographic boundary itself is now physically shifting. Researchers confirm that Powell's arid divide, the 20-inch rainfall line, has crept roughly 140 miles eastward, pushing dry conditions directly into the traditionally fertile Midwest. America's westward expansion relied on the assumption that sheer willpower and engineering could conquer a dry continent. But as the reservoirs drain and the dry line moves east, the Great Rain Wall proves that nature always dictates the final boundary of human survival. If you turn the lights on across North America at night, you see a striking imbalance in human settlement. 80% of the United States population is crammed into the eastern half of the country, leaving a massive dark void across the west. And even within that western half, the vast majority of people are clustered tightly along the Pacific coast strip. Take them out of the equation, and the entire continental interior is practically empty. This math of U.S. population density shows exactly where this void begins. There is a sharp cutoff that runs straight down the center of the country. This line is the 100th meridian west, a specific longitudinal marker. This demographic divide shows that a century and a half of modern technological progress hasn't erased geography. An invisible physical gatekeeper still dictates exactly where American society can easily thrive. In 1878, a geologist and explorer named John Wesley Powell documented this anomaly. During his expeditions through the American West, Powell noticed that right around this specific longitude, lush green landscapes abruptly turned into dry, barren dirt. This chart compares the annual rainfall of eastern and western cities, and it illustrates Powell's core finding. East of the meridian, cities like Dallas get nearly 40 inches of rain a year. Cross the line into the west, and precipitation instantly plummets below 20 inches, the bare minimum needed to grow most crops without irrigation. That strict 20-inch data limit dictates the agricultural reality on the ground. It defines the exact boundary between where farmers can rely on rainfall to plant profitable, thirsty crops like corn, and where they are forced to grow drought-resistant wheat. Powell took this data to Congress to warn them that the West could not support dense settlement. The government ignored his report entirely, opting instead to promote aggressive homesteading and push settlers onto arid land that couldn't support them. The United States spent decades attempting to conquer the western half of the continent by intentionally ignoring the ecological laws that governed it. The aridity Powell documented is driven by a massive atmospheric engine, created by the extreme topography of the continent itself. The western half of North America is dominated by a 3,000-mile-long wall of mountain ranges, with peaks reaching 14,000 feet into the sky. This physical barrier stands directly in the path of weather systems blowing in from the Pacific Ocean. This cross-section demonstrates a rain shadow. As wet ocean air hits the mountains, it's forced upward. It cools, condenses, and dumps its rain entirely on the western slopes. By the time that air crosses the peaks, it has been stripped of its moisture. Over in the east, the landscape is entirely different. The Appalachian Mountains are much shorter, barely half the height of the Rockies. They offer very little resistance to storm clouds, allowing moisture from the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico to freely water the eastern plains. Because of this permanent atmospheric blockade, the western interior was always biologically destined for water scarcity, regardless of human ambition. Knowing that water would be the limiting factor, Powell proposed a science-based mapping solution. He argued that western state borders should be drawn based on natural watersheds, topographical basins where all rainfall naturally collects and drains into a single river system. This would ensure every new state had full control over its own self-contained water supply. But politicians in Washington rejected the idea. They preferred neat, orderly maps, so they sliced the region into perfect, arbitrary squares. These straight lines chopped natural river systems into pieces, guaranteeing that multiple states would have to share and compete for the exact same scarce water. To justify this mapping strategy, politicians and railroad lobbyists heavily promoted a theory called rain follows the plow. They claimed that the physical act of cultivating the soil would actually alter the atmospheric climate and bring rainfall to the desert. It was a complete fiction. By prioritizing aesthetically pleasing maps and agricultural methods over hard ecological data, 19th century lawmakers legislated a 21st century water war. For a time, 20th century engineering managed to mask this geographical reality. The federal government built massive concrete dams and complex river diversions to artificially trap and move fresh water across the desert. This infrastructure allowed millions of people to settle into sprawling cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas, environments that naturally lacked the water resources to support large human populations. But this demographic boom relies on a highly fragile system. These cities depend on heavily siphoning a single shared source, the Colorado River, to sustain 40 million people across multiple competing states. Now, the region is experiencing its worst megadrought in 1,200 years. The Colorado River is drying up, and major engineered reservoirs are severely depleted, leaving stark white rings on the canyon walls, exactly where the water used to be. This severe drop in water levels proves that human engineering never actually defeated the aridity of the West. It merely delayed it, building up a massive ecological debt that is finally coming due. And the latest climate data reveals an even more alarming trend. The sharp boundary of aridity that Powell identified at the 100th meridian is no longer static. Driven by a warming climate, that dividing line is actively shifting eastward toward the 98th meridian. This eastward migration pushes dry conditions directly into the traditionally fertile Midwest. Millions of acres of rain-fed agricultural land now face the same intense water constraints that have historically restricted farming in the Deep West. As reservoirs empty and rivers fail to reach the sea, states are turning against each other in court to fight over dwindling allocations of water. It is the exact scenario John Wesley Powell predicted 150 years ago. Society can draw all the arbitrary political borders it wants on a map and engineer massive concrete structures to bend rivers to its will. But eventually, nature enforces its own lines. If you look at this nighttime satellite image of the United States, you can actually see an invisible wall dividing the country. To the right of this line, a nearly continuous chain of glowing lights stretches all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. To the left, there is an ocean of darkness. Exactly 80% of the American population lives packed into the eastern side of this divide. The 20% of Americans who do live out west are mostly huddled on the far edges of the continent, crammed into a narrow strip of land right along the Pacific coast. This extreme clustering leaves roughly a third of the entire United States mainland almost entirely empty of any human settlement. This map of atmospheric moisture flows shows exactly why this massive interior remains empty. It's caused by a geographic phenomenon known as a rain shadow. When heavy rain-filled clouds roll in from the Pacific Ocean, they hit a physical wall, the 14,000-foot peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The clouds are forced upward and drop their moisture on the western slopes, leaving the air dry by the time it reaches the interior. The much lower elevation of the Appalachians creates a very different outcome. These mountains are not high enough to block the humid air currents rolling in from the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. Instead, moisture passes freely over the peaks, blanketing the entire eastern half in reliable rain. These atmospheric patterns effectively split the nation into two distinct environments, a humid, fertile interior and a vast arid wasteland. This geography created a persistent tension between the natural limits of the land and the human drive to expand across it. In 1878, geologist John Wesley Powell was the first to identify the exact point where the landscape changes. While surveying the West, he noticed that at the 100th meridian of longitude, average rainfall drops below 20 inches a year. Powell realized that past this invisible line, traditional farming without irrigation was impossible. This was the only way to ensure that water management remained local and efficient. Congress ignored the warning and applied the same 160-acre homestead plots to the desert that they used in the humid East. Thousands of families were pushed into a landscape that simply did not receive enough rain to sustain their farms. To force settlement onto this land anyway, the United States spent the 20th century building massive infrastructure projects. Engineers used millions of tons of concrete to redirect and store scarce water in reservoirs, attempting to bypass the natural aridity identified by Powell. Today, major cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas exist because of this artificial support system. They depend almost entirely on the heavily manipulated flow of the Colorado River, which is redirected through hundreds of miles of pipelines and aqueducts. Maintaining dense human population in the American West requires a continuous, high-stakes engineering effort to withhold the natural return of the desert. While the West required massive dams and pipelines to sustain growth, the eastern half of the country possessed a set of natural advantages that required no engineering at all. The geography here created a rare intersection. First, high-quality soil stretches across the Midwest. Second, atmospheric patterns dump reliable rain directly on top of it. Beneath this agricultural zone lies the Mississippi River Basin, a network of deep, navigable rivers branching through the country's center. This river system provided a massive transportation network that was essentially free to use. Early farmers could float their crops out of the deep interior and straight to global markets without the need for an extensive road or rail network. These natural advantages are why 80% of the population settled in the East. They followed the combination of reliable food production and effortless commercial transit, which generated immense wealth over the last century. The East was able to grow and modernize far more efficiently than the West, because its primary infrastructure, the water, the soil, and the transit, was provided by the geography of the continent itself. For 150 years, the United States was built on the assumption that this dividing line between the wet East and the dry West was a fixed feature of the landscape. But modern data proves the line is moving. Researchers have confirmed that the boundary of the arid West is sliding eastward. Driven by changing temperatures, the dividing line Powell first identified at the 100th meridian has already physically migrated roughly 140 miles, pushing the dry climate into the 98th meridian. This shift is currently pushing the engineered West to its limits. A 1,200-year megadrought is draining the reservoirs, and the Colorado River is now so depleted that it often fails to reach the sea. At the same time, this aridity is beginning to eat into the fertile Midwest. As the rain shadow expands, it threatens the reliable rainfall that has supported the Eastern economy for over a century. John Wesley Powell warned that civilization would have to adapt to the local environment to survive. As the geographic alignment that supported American growth for 150 years begins to shift, the nation is being forced to face the hard climate limits it chose to ignore. The Western interior is an environmental trap. Human existence out here requires constant, desperate resource management just to survive against the physical geography. But an agricultural wasteland looks entirely different when viewed from the perspective of an invading foreign army. Any military force attempting to land on the Pacific coast and march east faces a massive logistical nightmare. They would have to transport soldiers, fuel, and supplies across thousands of miles of waterless valleys and scorching deserts, constantly bottlenecked by mountain ranges that limit movement. This map illustrates what geopolitical strategists call the fortress continent. The empty, arid West operates as a massive buffer zone, physically separating the populated, productive eastern seaboard from potential naval-based threats originating in the Pacific. Most global nation-states share flat, accessible land borders with rivals. That geography forces them to spend a high percentage of their national budgets to maintain large, standing armies for constant border defense. Because this natural barrier minimized the risk of land-based conflict, the United States avoided the economic drain of frequent border wars on its home soil. This allowed the nation to direct its capital into industrializing the East and building dominant financial hubs. The conditions that make the Western interior difficult to settle were essential to the East's rise as a global superpower, providing a layer of geographic insulation that few other nations possess. But the invisible climate boundary that shaped the nation's development is no longer stationary. This map shows how rising global temperatures are altering atmospheric currents. Researchers confirm the arid dividing line has already moved roughly 140 miles to the east, pushing directly into historically fertile territory in the Midwest. This shift creates a direct conflict with the American agricultural heartland. As rainfall becomes less reliable, farmers are forced to abandon water-heavy crops like corn for drought-resistant wheat or adopt expensive irrigation systems that are already depleting groundwater reserves. The very geographic system that inadvertently provided a century of security is now migrating, forcing the nation to re-engineer the agricultural foundations that sustain its population. Desert metropolises like Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Los Angeles operate as if they are lush green oases. They are packed with golf courses, green lawns, and massive water fountains, all baking under the desert sun. So how do cities with millions of residents manage to thrive in an environment specifically designed by nature to starve them of water? The answer goes back to 1878 and a geologist named John Wesley Powell. As he explored the western frontier, he was the first scientist to officially map the drop-off in rainfall right at the 100th meridian. Powell brought his data straight to Congress with a clear warning. He explained that beyond this line, the average rainfall dropped below 20 inches a year. That meant the American West was too dry for the standard farming and settlement practices that worked back east. This map shows Powell's solution. Instead of arbitrary blocks, western borders should be drawn along natural watersheds where water collects and drains, ensuring an equitable share. But politicians ignored his warnings, rejecting science to carve the landscape into the rigid, perfect square borders we see today. By drawing square lines through a world defined by flowing water, the government created a political structure ignoring the basic environmental constraints of the region. Because those political boundaries ignored geography, the western states quickly ran into severe water shortages. To keep these communities from failing, engineers diverted entire river systems and built massive concrete storage basins to overcome the desert's lack of rain. This meant building the largest, most expensive concrete dams in human history. By plugging narrow canyons, engineers hoarded billions of gallons of seasonal snowmelt. Once they captured the water, they moved it. They built sprawling networks of aqueducts and canals to forcibly pump that trapped water hundreds of miles across dry land into growing cities and farms. The adoption of air conditioning after the 1970s allowed these artificially watered deserts to become year-round hubs for millions of new residents. It made a region that was once too hot to inhabit into one of the most popular places to live. The populations living in the western interior are not sustained by the natural climate. They exist inside an engineered system that depends entirely upon a reliable and finite supply of fresh water. To make matters worse, as global temperatures rise, the actual physical location of the 100th meridian is moving. The arid conditions that define the West are actively expanding toward the East Coast. Studies confirm that the dry boundary has already shifted roughly 140 miles eastward. This creeping aridity is pushing directly into the fertile farmland of the Midwest, threatening crops that have never needed to rely on complex irrigation. Despite this, millions of Americans continue moving westward into the exact zones that are rapidly losing their water, driven by economic opportunities and a preference for the climate. They are settling on land that is actively losing its artificial life support, ignoring the geographic limits that scientists have understood for over a century. Decades of engineering only managed to delay the reality of the 100th meridian. As the reservoirs drain and the dry line marches eastward, the invisible boundary that divides the continent is finally reasserting its absolute law.